Well, I hope you enjoyed that. There's some fantastic comments coming in the chat, some really interesting questions, actually, and some insights shared from your own experiences of working in these types of environment and also engaging in debriefs. We're going to have a panel discussion now. So it looks like Dhruv is with us, which is fantastic because he's got a lot of clinical work to cover as well. So thank you, Dhruv, and a huge thanks again for your contribution. We're also joined by Cheryl Gillis, who's a paediatric intensive care consultant in Glasgow and a big friend of LFE, part of the team, and Ganga Verma, who's a consultant in Southampton in maternal and fetal medicine, and very engaged in the Civility Saves Lives movement. So welcome to both of you. We're also going to try and do a poll in this panel session, but I think we'll start off just by getting some reflections from the panelists. We may also be joined by Henna, but we're not sure if she's going to be able to join us. So if possible, we'll bring Henna in too. So Cheryl, can I come to you first? Just general reflections on what you heard.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much to Dhruv and Henna and to Adrian and Chris, because I thought that those were both excellent talks again. And, you know, I've documented pages of notes that I could easily talk about, loads of things that it brings up for me, and I identify with so much of what was said. But I guess I've got a few thoughts on sort of both aspects. But the first thing I wanted to say was, I think, which is very much reflected in the chat box, is unfortunately the discussion that Dhruv has led with us. I think we have to acknowledge that situation isn't over yet, and we are all currently still working under such immense pressures, each of us in our own little way. For us in paediatrics, it was that all the anticipation and excitement and all those things in paediatric intensive care that Dhruv talked about, and then it was followed by very little, actually, which had its own challenges, and now suddenly is being followed by a very difficult winter, which I know all of you are very aware of. And I think there's a lot in the chat boxes about the fact that the chronicity of what's been happening is really, really challenging for people. And I think even in a positive conference like that, we need to acknowledge that and the impact that that has on all of us. But I want to just pick up on a bit of Dhruv's talk that I think is really, really positive, and probably the key thing, and even despite the chronicity, is actually we are still being successful in the healthcare we deliver every single day for the vast majority, despite these horrendous pressures we're under. And what is it that has made teams successful? And Dhruv said it really clearly, but it's just something that I thought was so important to kind of think about, and probably feeds back into that leadership and how quality leadership can really create that success in teams. And a lot of it was, first of all, it was the common goal and having that common purpose. And I think that common purpose is still there, even if it is just to get through the day as safely as possible and keep as many of our patients safe as possible. But it made me think, well, what was it that allowed that to happen, that rapid change that Dhruv talked about, and the fact that it was so often still safe and effective. And I think that because it was a pandemic, it was so different. The style of management and leadership was different than what we're used to in the NHS on a day-to-day basis. And people were given that opportunity to basically just, here's the problem, here's what you've got, run with it and do. And the amazing thing is, when you give people that opportunity without too many restrictions, it's phenomenal what they come up with. All the things that Dhruv was saying, you've suddenly created ventilator spaces out of nothing. You have increased consumables by 200%. You've created these things that didn't exist, and if you had talked about them a month ago, everyone would have fainted in the room. And yet you have successfully done your job and delivered good quality healthcare. And I think it's, how do we take those lessons forward into our day-to-day life, into healthcare in general? And I think some of the frustration comes from the fact that even those people who are higher up in management than me often aren't the ones with all the control, and we feel that sense of, lack of control. But I think as leaders on the shop floor, what can we do? Well, I think learning that lesson, if you go to people and you dictate every part of that problem, you'll probably get it wrong. If you go to people and you work with them as the leader, with that compassion for how they feel about things, with that listening, with that openness that you don't have all the answers. And I think that's where true vulnerability maybe is. It's not weakness, it's that ability to say that I can't have all the answers, but let me help you as a team so that we can do that. And for the very brief spell that I spent in adult ICU during the second wave, which was a mere drop in the ocean compared to what my colleagues have been doing so consistently, like Dhruv and a lot of others. But what I saw was amazing, you know, and the stories of plumbing in the hemodialysis machine, and for the first week when someone flushed the toilet, you couldn't clear the potassium, but the innovation, the adaptation, it's incredible. And I think that is a real positive in a sea of what can feel like a lot of negativity and is still an ongoing struggle. And I suppose if I could just say one other thing, because I wanted to touch on the debrief stuff as well, because working in paediatric intensive care, I very much identify with those high risk, situations where things don't go right. I identify with all the things that both Chris and Adrian brought up in terms of how you feel in your own humanity and all of those things. But I have seen the power of debrief working so well. And one example for me was a case of an unexpected death in PICU, which is actually quite rare, believe it or not. And the debriefs that came out of that led to such a lovely perspective from the other teams around, because it wasn't just our team, it was the other teams that had been involved. And I think without that space, I never would have gained the perspective, or at least had an insight into the perspective of how my other specialty colleagues perceived that situation. We then just led to this absolute openness around this case, where there was no blame, where it was about the compassion for each other, the compassion for the patient and the family. And what led on from that was probably the best learning experience I've ever had in medicine. And it was just so powerful. And I think if I can give one last reflection, thinking about in these horrible, challenging times where we are challenged and we feel like that compassion burnout is coming, how do we maintain it? Well, I think those human touch points are the only way, trying to utilize those periods of time, things like debrief, like being with your consultant colleagues, as Dhruv said, where you allow that humanity to come back in, where you hear and listen to each other so that you can develop that compassion. And, as Camilla said in the first talk, it's not easy, it's a consistent process, but I think that to me is, well, if that might be part of how on earth can we maintain our humanity and our compassion when we are faced with this challenge constantly. And, that's...
Thank you, Cheryl. That's fantastic reflection. So I'm going to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak in this panel. So Dhruv, I just come to you. What do you reckon? I'm sure you recognise that, because it came up in our conversation, this idea that when you drop the bureaucracy and the top-down leadership and you task the frontline staff to get on with it, then a whole load of innovation and capability comes forth.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And Cheryl summarised it really well. I think if we just recognize that every day, the reason we all come to work, whether you're a manager or a clinician or a healthcare professional of sorts, we're doing it for one sole reason, and that's to look after our patients. And so if we just remember that every day, because we do get bogged down into our particular areas and divisions, and we're trying to look after those boundaries. And sometimes we have to take a bird's eye view of the entire hospital or place that you work and see where the biggest pressure is. And that's what happened for the pandemic, right? We just realized that this is where the biggest pressure is going to be for the whole hospital. And so therefore we're going to focus on those areas, and that might change on a week by week basis. And that's short term, but also long and medium term. And I really like that, leadership by showing vulnerability, not weakness. It is really important. And I definitely know that the people that I look up to and will avidly listen to and respect are the ones that have shown me some form of vulnerability, rather than this gung-ho, this is what I'm going to do and you're going to do it attitude. Just doesn't get people to tick in the right way.
Absolutely. Thanks, Drew. Henna, can I come to you on the other point that Cheryl highlighted? Was not. I'm hoping you can hear us, Henna, but it's not just the benefit of debriefing is for kind of our own psychology, but also to get a shared perspective. So you hear from other professionals about what their experiences and how their world works for them. It kind of breaks down barriers.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry, I'm out and about in London at the moment, so and caught me on the go. But I think it's about the, we do have the professionals within our group. We've had plenty of them. I guess less so, there were lots of questions about domestics and cleaners being part of it. And it's more their space to be able to talk when they're on shift and things like that. And I guess we could make a concerted effort to include all those voices as well. There does tend to be a heavy medical focus, but it's about putting those story pieces together for everybody. So physiotherapists, for example, who've been part of the, part of the work, occupational therapy has been invited, various different types of nursing staff. So we have a range of staff that are able to get a space that they may not even work together. So sometimes we have different departments. So if you have a renal patient, we may have the renal team participate, and that's okay, because that voice is important and they actually find it very useful to hear what happened, because they don't know. Once they go into ICU, the doors are closed and they're not sure what actually happened. So being able to share that story, answer their questions, express emotions, feel held by even strangers, because they don't necessarily know each other or work together. But I think that closeness that you can form in a debrief is really important.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, and it's also consistent with what we're basing the theme of this meeting on, and reflecting on, it sort of highlights this interdependence, how we're all one team, and breaking down boundaries can only help improve performance. Ganga, can I come to you for the final word in this panel? I mean, I'll just ask you, do you have any particular reflections from what you've heard?
Yeah, absolutely. Two really fantastic talks, and it's a real pleasure to be able to share my reflections on them. I guess with the pandemic, I came from it from quite a different perspective to Dhruv. I was a trainee at the time and working in obstetrics. So it was quite different, because I think what we talked about, that energy and that anxiety that was causing people to want to do things, and some of us felt like we didn't know what to do with that energy, and that was quite tricky, and a lot of us kind of struggled with that. And there were, amongst the junior doctors, I think especially, we were finding it really hard, because we were just being told what to do and how things were going to change, but weren't being listened to as much. And I think it took a few weeks for us to kind of get ourselves heard and to become more systematic in gathering our thoughts and feelings and presenting those to management. And then once we started being heard, the whole process became so much easier. So we managed to get management to kind of have weekly meetings with us, just even if they weren't able to solve things, just feeling heard made such a difference. And I think that just highlights the point that Cheryl made about working, leading by working with people rather than just a top-down approach of being told stuff which didn't all make sense, and just having people listening to us. From the debrief talk that Henna gave, I mean, that was really fantastic, and it's amazing to hear that we've got psychologists on board on teams helping with those debrief processes. And I think in maternity, that's something we could really benefit with. I've not worked anywhere where we have access to psychologists in that way, and I think it's something that's definitely something we should bring in, and having them as somebody with the right kind of experience, but also being an outsider to the actual event, being able to lead those debrief processes just sounds like an like a really fantastic thing that needs to be rolled out further. One of the more kind of questions I guess I had for Hina was how you see kind of debriefs where lots of different people are involved from perhaps different parts of the hospital. So if, for instance, as obstetricians, we get called down to A&E and there's an SHO and a junior registrar in the middle of the night that get called down to an emergency in ED and things. And then obviously you've got the ED team there as well, you've got anaesthetists there, and then they all go off and do their own thing. And sometimes those events can be really traumatic, and they then have to go off and then manage all the other obstetric emergencies, and then they hear nothing about that event, and how we can manage that and make sure those junior doctors get debriefed, because you can then speak to them weeks later and they're still traumatized by this event, but haven't had an opportunity to debrief in the same way because the event didn't happen on labour ward, for instance, where we might manage that. And just kind of thoughts from Hina and the rest of the panel on that would be great.
I mean, what a great question. Let's just take a minute or so from Hina, and then we're going to have to move on to the break. So Hina, if you're able to give us some quick reflections on that excellent question, that would be fantastic. If you're still with us, that is. Or we may have to wait.
Hi, I am. There's just a lot of building work around. I feel like I'm reporting from the street of London. Right. So I guess, Gunga, you mentioned something about not having psychology. Was that your question? I missed it because of the noise.
The specific question was about how how we can coordinate debriefs when there are lots of different people from different parts of the hospital involved in a case. And what your kind of experiences with that. So
we have had that where we've had, as I said, multiple teams from different parts of the hospital. Zoom, as I said before in the talk, we find is most accessible, although I see the disconnect between not having a person in the room, and the pandemic has really separated us physically from each other. And actually we are social creatures. We need each other, especially in a hospital setting. And I think, Drew, you talked about work family and how do we connect the larger family, all the extended family, I guess, within the hospital. So using that forum, but also allowing space for people to use. So if there's 80 people in a debrief, I think the largest one we conducted was about 67 people. We did use the chat box a lot, and people could participate that way. So even though they may have not been able to have the space within the hour to speak, just being able to facilitate people, and for a psychologist or somebody moderating that chat, talking about the themes, pulling together people's ideas, connecting it for people, connecting that story, I think is the bit that you value, because your story is very disconnected otherwise. So being able to have a voice that connects you and runs the thread through the actual debrief, I think is the valuable bit, rather than the different teams, the different people who don't know each other in the room.
Thank you, Hina. Yeah, this is fantastic. We could go on, couldn't we? But let's make sure that we get our breaks. I just put a poll up around debriefing, some questions. We're curious to see what the uptake of or availability of debriefing is. I think I'll leave that on until we come back after the break, and then I'll share the results. So I'm looking around the room here. Should we start again at 12 or a bit later?
Yeah, maybe just slightly after.
12.
Yeah, we've got our next lot of posters to.
Okay, yeah. So
well.
Emma's reminding me. I'm going to put up the next lot of posters, and you can answer the poll. Go and get some break from the screen time as well, and we'll start at 12:05 with a session on inspiration and joy. It's going to be fantastic. But thanks again to all the panelists and to Drew and Hina, and yeah, enjoy your break.